And we just lost video. Hold on. Okay, so who's excited about cybersecurity education standards? That's a super sexy topic, right? This is definitely going to be one of those how the sausage gets made talks. And just a preview, the process of making the sausage is not pretty, okay? So just a quick introduction. My co-speaker, Chaim Sanders, could not be here, so it's just me today. We are both professors at RIT. We both teach in a security department, which, as you'll see, is a surprisingly rare thing. Okay? We're both full-time security professors. Well, he's no longer a full-time security professor. He has since gone back into industry and is the director of security for ZeroFox these days. And we're both interested in application security as well as we both have a background in pen testing and cybersecurity education because that's where we've been working in for quite a long time. Now, this talk kind of stemmed out of our interactions as members of a cybersecurity department's curriculum committee. And just a preview, members of a curriculum committee do not get any love from anybody. It is one of the most thankless jobs ever because you're oftentimes telling your colleagues how they should improve their classes or how their classes should be being updated based on what other people are doing. And administrators are not fond of you because you're often initiating very expensive change. Okay? And really we were taking a look this past year at how to update RIT's curriculum as the Rochester Institute of Technology, and we realized that this is probably something industry doesn't have a lot of idea about in terms of what's actually going on in higher ed inside of the machine, so to speak. And it's probably something that both hiring managers and, I guess, industry in general who are concerned about the future of cybersecurity should be aware of. So we started off with some research questions. First of which, how do universities decide if and or where to teach cybersecurity? Now, that's not an obvious question because cybersecurity is a new thing. Okay, it's a new discipline, and there are a lot of traditional technology disciplines. So oftentimes, cybersecurity is not its own thing. It's rolled into something else. Many times it's coming down as the current hot new thing that institutions want to do because it attracts attention, it attracts grants. So we were interested in what does this landscape look like? And how do universities decide, if they are going to teach security, how do institutions decide what they're going to teach within security? Security is a huge field, right? I mean, we all know that. How many practitioners do we have in here? Okay. How many educators do I have in here? One? Okay. Awesome. How many hiring folks do I have in here? People who do hiring for security positions, because that's really one of the major audiences for this talk. No one. Okay. Cool. All right. So we've got a diverse group. So security is a huge, huge field, and as we'll see, it's not always obvious what institutions are going to cover within security as a discipline. You could go highly technical. You could also go highly non-technical, more GRC type positions, okay, or more GRC type content. And there are a number of external factors from the university that influence which security topics they cover. Will this become standardized? So that's a big question. There's a lot of standardization in tech programs in higher ed. Cybersecurity is not standardized yet. There's no accreditations yet. And it's an interesting question as to what, if that's coming down the pipeline and what those are going to look like. Spoilers, that is coming down the pipeline and it looks weird. Okay, it looks really weird in many respects. Finally, how does what people are doing actually map to job functions? And in fact, is there a mapping? Can you look at someone based on the kind of degree they have, or the institution they went, or the kinds of accreditations that institution has, and decide what and if, what kind of job makes the most sense for them? Okay, so let's start off with the problem, a description of the problem. So why should we care about education? Well, security is a growing field. How much it's growing, as you'll see, is a bit of a mystery. Okay, it turns out there just aren't great numbers on this. What we have here are the numbers for the from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics tracking information security analyst growth over the past 3 or 4 years, okay? So information security analysts are growing, but that only represents a very tiny fraction of security as an industry, okay? This doesn't take into account your pen testers, your reverse engineers. This doesn't take into account business analysts that are focusing on security, or people who are actually implementing security controls like system administrators or network administrators, okay? And if we actually look at the problem, we don't even have good numbers as to how many jobs are available, in our field, or really how many people there are in this field. So we took a cross-sectional look at a number of different studies trying to quantify security as a discipline, and we found that, depending on the study, there's somewhere between about 770,000 security professionals in the U.S. or 1.6 million, right? That is a huge gap. That is almost 100% error, right? That is an enormous gap. We can't even quantify that. Globally, if we think globally, there's somewhere between 4 million and 6 million people globally. That's also a huge gap. That's about about 1/3 discrepancy. Okay. Now, if you actually start comparing this, these numbers are probably low. Okay. So if we start thinking about how many people attend conferences like this or conferences like DEF CON, when we start crunching the numbers, that means about 1 in 10 people have went to DEF CON last year. That's probably low. Right? Okay. Having 1 in 10 security professionals attend DEF CON seems like a very high number, given the amount of people who aren't into that kind of security or into that kind of culture. So we do have a big problem in terms of figuring out what the data actually looks like for quantifying our field. And if we actually look at what education is doing, education is not helping solve this knowledge gap so far. So when we try and look at, maybe we don't know what the field looks like, but maybe we can figure out how many people were graduating into security jobs or graduating with security concentrations. And no, that's not data that exists either, because as it turns out, graduation rates are one of the most closely guarded facts of a college. Okay, they don't publish that information. It's hard to get at it. You'll notice that we don't have that for RIT. We were able to show some things, but no exact numbers. Okay, and when we start looking at what schools are actually doing this, there isn't even a good tracking of the data as to what schools are doing cybersecurity. So there are some good schools. We only know they're kind of good by their reputation. Okay, places like UTSA, which traditionally does very well in CCDC events. Same thing with the University of Maryland. They're traditionally very strong in kind of competitions. Central Florida has built up a bit of a reputation for itself, but we don't really have any good idea, because higher ed isn't tracking this. There is no World News and Report studies for this kind of thing, at least at the undergraduate level. There's some rudimentary tracking at the graduate level, but not at the undergraduate level at all. So let's start making some assumptions. So let's suppose, so RIT's program was about 120 students, give or take. Okay. Let's suppose, and we have some data indicating that roughly 90 of those were graduating in a given year. So let's assume that 3 out of 4 students are graduating. And we're graduating 3 out of the 4 students enrolled in some kind of security program. Okay. Now that's also taking into account everyone who switches majors, everyone who drops out, or takes longer to complete their degree. And we'll assume that it's 3 out of 4, and we'll assume that RIT is fairly standard. But you'll note that there's no real basis for that assumption. Okay, since this data is not available, since there's no data available about this, our assumption may be totally wrong that RIT is a good model for this. Okay. So we did some analysis and found that there are about 137 schools with some kind of security program. All right. Now we're getting this data from NSA designations and from some other accreditations, but we found about 134 colleges producing undergraduates in cybersecurity. Now, if we do some basic math and assume that we're graduating about 90 students per year from 137 colleges, at most we're producing about 12,000 security students per year. Okay? We're producing about 12,000 graduates. Now, if we go back to the previous slide and think about those numbers, we have a huge gap in that we're about somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people short in cybersecurity at the moment. Okay? So we continue doing a little bit of math. Let's suppose we take the CyberSeek numbers from that previous slide, where we had about 1.1 million total security jobs. Okay, if we assume that cybersecurity is right, and if we assume that those 1.1 million jobs are distributed across all skill levels, okay, or all experience levels, we can divide that by 40 years if we assume that each person in security is working about 40 years. Okay? Now, what that means is that we have a number of jobs that are going to be opening in the very near future as well. Okay? In order to meet that demand, we actually need to be producing about, assuming that most people are getting their security experience or their security basis from a 4-year school, we need to be producing about 28,000 students per year. We're producing 12,000. So there's definitely a big shortfall, and we need to think about how can we do the absolute best that we can with security students. And how do we do that? So we're going to start talking about what does academia think is the best approach. All right, and I already see some people in the room kind of smirking a little bit at saying, at kind of thinking about what academia's view on the best approach is, and you'll probably be a little bit right there. But let me note too that we're going to be talking about a lot of different groups, and I should explain how they're all related. And also note that we are not affiliated with any of them, except I am listed as a contributor on one ABET document because I submitted a comment that said, this thing is crazy. Okay? Yeah. So the way that a lot of curriculum gets developed, ACM, that's the Association for Computing Machinery, if you're not familiar, one of the biggest organizations in the computing discipline, puts out these curricular guidelines that nobody has to follow. Right? These are just a set of things that ACM says, hey, we think students should learn this, and we think students should get this amount of exposure to these topics. Okay? Nobody has to follow these. There's no penalties for not following them. People could just entirely disregard them, and in many cases do. Okay? What oftentimes matters more is accreditation. Okay? That a college's computing program is accredited, which is separate from accreditation for a college. Okay? There's two kinds of accreditation. A college can be accredited as a college by an organization such as Middle States, or it can have specific programs accredited by accrediting bodies within that field. Now, the field for computing, or the body that accredits computing programs, is called ABET. I don't remember what that stands for off the top of my head, and there are two main two main kinds of accreditations that ABET does. Computing accreditations and engineering accreditations. So we'll be talking about the Computing Accreditation Commission within ABET. I turned this off, I swear. Come on. Okay. Now, as far as accreditation goes, we're going to be seeing some interesting things coming down the way. Okay. So ABET is the only body that does academic accreditation. All right. The NSA does some interesting things in this space, but they don't have accreditations. They have what they call designations, which has a little bit of a different connotation within academia. Initially, the NSA stuff that came down only dictated what classes colleges had to offer. That doesn't mean that students actually had to be able to take those classes to be NSA accredited. Okay, as long as the college, let's say, had a network security class that it taught from time to time, it didn't matter whether students actually could take that class or pass it. Okay, that looks like it's changing. NSA is kind of getting its act together and starting to look more like a traditional accreditation program. So within the accreditation space, we've got ABET, we've got NSA, and ABET is looking very soon to propose a set of security accreditations, okay? Which I think many in the crowd will have some thoughts on when we get to them. And we're going to talk about some recommendations as to what makes sense for this space and what doesn't. So let's start digging into ACM, okay? We're going to start off with computer science. And right before the talk, somebody even went so far as to remark to me that he had a computer science degree and never touched security, okay? And that makes perfect sense. So what we have here are the ACM curriculum recommendations for computer science. This is a huge chart. You can go and look this up online. It's all public data. But we should explain it a little bit, okay? So what we have are different fundamental knowledge units within the curriculum, okay? Software development fundamentals, algorithms of complexity, and so on. Now, you'll see two numbers there, T1 and T2. So T1 and T2 describe instructional hours, okay? Not credit hours, but instructional hours. These are the number of hours that a student is supposed to be in a room with some kind of instructor, okay? Tier 1 are required instructional hours, meaning that in order to be compliant with the ACM guidelines, not that anyone actually has to be compliant with the ACM guidelines, you have to say, be in a classroom teaching software development fundamentals to students for 43 hours. Now, what does 43 hours mean to someone outside academia? All right? Your typical class, in your typical class, you meet about 3 hours a week, give or take. Okay? Your typical class also runs for about 15 weeks. So most of the time, an instructor is seeing their student for about 45 instructional hours per semester. All right? So one college class, typically results in about 45 instructional hours. All right? So that kind of makes sense for software development fundamentals. That's one class. That's about one class, give or take a couple of instructional hours. So if we take a look at where information assurance and security falls on this, so students are required to take 3 instructional hours. If you're following along closely, what does 3 instructional hours equate to? 1 week. What this means is a computer science student is supposed to have at least 1 week of security. That's 3 one-hour lectures on security, and that's all a computer science student absolutely has to have. Okay? Now, we've got this Tier 2. Tier 2 are optional hours that are strongly suggested in ACM. Sort of tells you you should have some high percentage of these, but they don't specify what that is. Okay? So for security and assurance, we've got another 6 hours in there. So another 2 weeks. Okay? So that's somewhere between 1 to 3 weeks of security, and that's all a computer science student needs to learn about security. I'm going to pause and let that sink in. You can learn. Someone who's going to come out and presumably be a software developer needs 1 to 3 weeks on security. Okay, let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into that. Okay, So if we delve into those 3 to 9 credit hours, well, what does this actually look like? Okay, well, we've got 1 Tier 1 hour on foundational concepts. I think most security students typically get 1 semester on foundational concepts. Okay, we have 1 to 2 instructional hours on secure design. So if we think about everybody who's out there building, let's say, web apps, they got 1 to 2 lectures on how to securely design a web app. That's not very much. And if we keep going, delving down, one of my favorites is you have computer science students have 1 optional hour to learn everything they need to know about cryptography. Yeah, right? 1 optional hour. Students don't, it's not a requirement, but ACM has said that as far as computer science goes, a sufficient computer science education might have 1 lecture on crypto. Is it any wonder why we don't see people hashing passwords? Okay? If we delve into this a little bit more, oftentimes those optional credit hours end up translating into elective classes. So here, what we have here is the template syllabus that ACM puts out as to what a security class would actually look like. But again, nobody actually has to do this. If we start delving into this actually probably isn't a bad elective, okay? In that it's mostly network security, or application security, which does seem a little bit of an odd choice for a computer science student. Application security certainly makes a lot of sense for someone who's going to go be a programmer. Not so sure about that much in NetSec, okay? But we don't see as much crypto, we don't see as much foundational concepts or secure design. Now, computer science might be one of the worst on the list, but we also have other kinds of degrees, okay? That's not the only kind of degree that people graduate with. So if we start taking a look at what this kind of looks like for information technology programs, it's a little bit different, okay? So we do have a requirement for information assurance and assurance and security, which is kind of ranked 5th at 23 instructional hours. So an IT professional needs about half a semester of security. Well, it's better than CS, I guess, but it still seems a little bit low. It's comparatively ranked at roughly the same place with integrative programming and with societal and professional issues. Okay. And then we have information systems, okay? Your typical non-technical degree. So this is the kind of person who might come out and be a business, tech analyst, a non-technical sort of analyst, more of a policy type person or a managerial position. The IS curriculum, the information systems curriculum, doesn't specify the number of credit hours a student has to take. Rather, they specify the courses a student has to take. And we have marked in green the courses that touch on security, that have some kind of significant security component in some respect. Okay? So I think one of the interesting things about information systems, the information systems degree, is that they are getting a pretty good amount of repetition of security amongst different classes. Repetition is good. Being exposed to a number of topics over and over again helps drive importance in. So I think this is not a bad thing. Okay? It also has 2 electives that kind of make sense for people going into GRC type positions. We have IT audit and control, okay, and we have security and risk management. And if we delve into those, the topics within these, again, they don't specify the amount of time spent on each one of these specific topics within these security electives, but these I think are probably pretty good courses for someone who's going to come out and not be a technical security person. Okay, this makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so how does this? I'm sorry. Before we get into that, so how do these curriculum guidelines translate into accreditation? Because Because accreditation is what schools have to do, right? This is the stick rather than the carrot, okay? So here we have the ABET requirements for being a computer science accredited program, okay? So if you want to be ABET accredited, you have to have students take 40 credits, that's not instructional hours, that's credit hours now, in algorithms, data structures, software design, concepts, org, a lot of math and a lot of science. But what are we missing here? We're missing security. Security is not a required class for the CS accreditation program, okay? Which is kind of how we get bugs, right? So students never have to actually take that. Now, I guess I should be a little bit. I should hedge a little bit there, because ABET does have some security stuff. Now, this is what a college has to do. The missing part of this is how a college proves it's doing the things it has to do. And there we talk about learning outcomes and we talk about assessment. So what does a college have to assess for this? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Assessments at the end. So what are the requirements for IT? Okay. So IT does explicitly have an assurance and security component, and it is fairly highly ranked. There is a fair amount of focus on it, okay? However, we'll see that, again, I want you to keep in mind this idea of assessment, that even though this is what a college has to do, this is not what a college has to necessarily prove they're doing. And for information systems, also, there has to be a fairly significant coverage of security. Okay? So how does this translate into assessment? Okay? So we have these three programs. Okay? 2 of the 3 require security. They require students to have to take security. Computer science does not explicitly require that the students have to take security. But it turns out nobody really requires that anybody assess security outcomes. Assess security learning outcomes. So what do these learning outcomes look like for CS? So there is a very broad excuse me, there's a very broad learning outcome where security is supposed to be a part of every program that ABET accredits. Okay, everybody is supposed to, everyone is supposed to take some kind of security if they're being ABET accredited. So this particular learning outcome applies to all 3 kinds of programs. Okay? But if we look at the CS specific one, what is inside the CS specific one? Algorithms, problem solving, no security. Okay? And as well as studying complexity. So even though CS is probably one of the most significant places where we need security in the software development lifecycle, no one's actually assessing excuse me. No one's actually assessing that CS students are getting the security they're supposed to be getting. And for information technology, which, remember, information technology had a specific requirement that students had to take security and assurance. Okay? So we have some things about applying current technical concepts to problem solving, analyzing user needs, effectively integrating IT solutions, and maybe we can shoehorn security as a part of understanding best practices. But that's it. That is the only thing that an IT program requires be assessed, best practices. So even though security is a requirement of IT degrees, it's not explicitly, it's not something that a IT program has to actually prove they're doing. And for information systems, again, there's one additional learning outcome for information systems, and it has nothing to do with security. Okay? So now that we've kind of delved into these 3 these three programs, where are students actually getting this? Okay, so if we look at where programs house, or where institutions house their security programs, what we see is that by and large, institutions house their security programs inside of computer science, where students might get 1 to 3 weeks on security, and where they might, and where there's no requirement that anybody assess whether or not students are actually learning security in those 1 to 3 hours. Okay. We also see some other really interesting things too. So CSEC is now security as its own thing is taking up an increasingly large portion of this pie, which I'm pleased to see. Being a security professor, I think that's probably a good way to go. But only about between a fifth and a quarter of schools have their own special security degree or their own special security department. Okay. Information systems is still reasonably large, okay, for non-technical security positions, but I think one of the more interesting ones two of the more interesting ones, IT seems to be the place where security is housed less and less, at only 8% of the pie, and computer engineering is actually the place where security is housed more than IT. Now, this is a study of about 170 institutions that offer some kind of security programs, so this is probably pretty representative. Okay, I'm sorry. This is a sample of about 40 institutions from 170. So this is an interesting breakdown. Now, pay attention to these because this idea of computer engineering is going to come up again and again. Because what we have not yet talked about, kind of the black sheep in the room, is what the NSA wants us to do. Okay? And the NSA has some strong opinions on this. Yeah. I'm kind of skipping over my memes. Okay? So we talked about the NSA designations at the beginning, and there's 3 levels of designation with NSA. Cyber defense, which is kind of high-level blue team. It's very broad, as we'll see in a moment. Cyber operations, which is kind of how this talk got started. The institution I was looking at was considering cyber operations and whether or not that would be a good designation to try and get, which is going to be, I'm going to argue that this makes sense for state-sponsored red teaming, but probably does not meet industry red teaming needs. Okay? And you also have CAERs, which is Cyber Defense Research. Really, this is an academic designation. It does not translate into any kind of curriculum requirement. Okay? But CD and CO do have very specific classes that students are going to have to take. Okay? We found about 140 schools, give or take, that have some kind of NSA designation. And within that, the most common one to have, and you'll see again why in a minute, is some variant of CAECD, okay, which is very broad, easier to get. But let's see here. 136 of the 140 schools have some variant of CAECD. Now, a lot of those are historical, meaning that they got that a long time ago, and there have been a number of pretty significant changes in the CAECD over the past 2 or 3 years in particular that might lead to those schools not being able to get their CAECD back when their time is up. Okay? Only 13 schools have CAECO. Okay? So that state-sponsored offense one, only 13 schools have a curriculum that the NSA deems as sufficient. And we've got 67 schools with CACR, and many of those also have CACD. In fact, I think all of those do. Okay? I'm sorry. 39 of the 67 overlap. Okay? So this is an interesting place to be in. So let's start off with CACD. What does this look like? Well, it's very broad. You can be either a 2-year or a 2-year or a 4-year school and get some kind of CACD designation. Okay? If you're going to be a 2-year school doing it, there's one set of requirements that you have to meet. There are 11 2-year core knowledge units that your curriculum has to implement. Okay? Now, if you want to have a 4-year designation, you also have to implement a number of additional knowledge units on top of on top of those 2-year knowledge units. So you have to have some additional 4-year knowledge units. You also have to have some optional ones, where students can pick some set from a list, more or less electives, if you will. So what we have for CACD, for the 2-year, we've got some IT, we've got some kind of system administration stuff, basic networking concepts, a little bit of basic programming, which a lot of people in IT hate programming. It's understandable, okay? We've got some more security-specific things like security design, but if we start breaking it down, this is actually pretty broad, okay? So the ones that are here are sort of red, indicate topics that are more traditionally computer science oriented. Okay? Green represents more IT oriented, and purple is again information systems oriented. So this foundation, it seems like almost anybody could get started doing this somehow. Okay? A lot of different programs, if you already have computer science, if you already have IS, if you already have IT, could get started doing this in some way. When we delve into 4-year, we start seeing more databases, more networking, operating systems, strangely probability and statistics. The orange coloring here is going to indicate anomalies, things that don't nicely fit into some other category, and a lot more programming, definitely more programming focused. But none of this is crazy. Okay, CACD, I mean, this kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to have a basic security analyst, this is not out there for what they need to know. Okay? Now, the optional knowledge units are where things get a little bit more interesting. So remember those numbers that we saw earlier in the graph? Okay, where we saw security being housed in different programs? That actually translate roughly, those numbers, the proportions, are very, very similar to what we see here. Okay? There are a sufficient number of operational knowledge units or optional knowledge units that almost any program could implement some things. If you wanted to have a CS security, you could have students take algorithms, data structures, operating systems theory, software reverse engineering. Those would make sense for computer science, a computer science degree that already exists, to maybe add 1 or 2 classes to the curriculum and be able to get this designation. IT, again, you could implement a number of these information assurance architectures, wireless sensor networks, advanced networking. None of this stuff would be hard for an existing IT program to implement. Or IS. We also see some strange ones here down at the end. So forensic accounting, that is an optional knowledge unit for CACD. I mean, it's not too weird, but it's probably a better fit for like a business program. If a business school wanted to get security designated, maybe focusing on risk management and that kind of thing, you might have classes like forensic accounting or fraud prevention. Okay, less technical ones. We also see some almost enough operational knowledge units for an engineering program to start getting into this, with embedded systems, hardware reversing, hardware and firmware security. There's almost enough that an engineering program could spin up a little bit of additional coursework and get this designation. Okay? And for the learning outcomes, the things that are actually supposed to be measured, we don't have anything too crazy. So here we have some sample learning outcomes for the Intro to Crypto core knowledge unit. Okay? So these are things that you expect anybody with some basic crypto experience to know. So I want to sort of focus on the reasonability of this, or how much this makes sense, because we're going to see some things in a minute that maybe don't make quite as much sense when we start talking about cyber operations. Okay, remember, this is the designation that we're arguing makes sense for state-sponsored offense. Okay, so we see a lot more focus on concepts like low-level programming, operating systems theory, cellular and mobile network technologies. That's a little weird, right? I mean, certainly a basic understanding of cellular and mobile technologies maybe that's a good thing for students to know, but unless you're working in that specific area, it doesn't seem like it's something that's core knowledge for an IT student. Okay? And then we have some weirder things down at the end. Okay? We have a section on legality. All right? Legality. Now, what does that mean? Well, what the NSA wants you to learn about the legality about legal issues relating to security includes some strange things like just war theory, and they want students going through this curriculum to study the Geneva Conventions. That's a little out there, right? That's a little strange, okay? That a security student would have to study the Geneva Conventions. But that's what the NSA kind of makes their claim. Now, also, you'll notice that as far as the coloring goes, we see red, we see green, but we don't see that purple that represents information systems. This is probably not a certification or a designation that makes sense for that kind of program. Okay? When we look at their optional knowledge units, we see more of a focus on hardware with things like architecture, programmable logic, embedded systems, and microcontroller design. Okay? Again, that makes sense for that probably makes sense for someone going into state-sponsored offense, but how often does a pen tester do we need to, let's say, design microcontrollers? Probably not too much, and really the biggest argument for that would be maybe making implants for things. Okay? You'll notice there's one thing lacking on both this slide and this slide, right? So although there is a required core knowledge unit on legal issues, there is no either required or optional knowledge unit on ethics. So, from the NSA's perspective, this cyber operations, this offensive designation, ethics is not something that students have to learn either as a core knowledge unit or as an optional knowledge unit. Okay. Now, what does the NSA actually want students to measure? Okay. So we have some things that make sense, such as a basic, thorough understanding of operating systems theory. Well, if you're going to be doing security, eventually you're going to hit OS, and you're going to have to learn how things like memory work, how things like disk writes work. That's not too out there. There are some things that aren't bad. So I said cellular was a little weird unless you're working specifically in that space. But what NSA wants as a measurable outcome includes being able to trace a packet end-to-end in a cellular network. Okay? Thinking about all the switching that goes on inside of the kind of carrier-grade network. Now, again, that's probably not bad for students to know. If the students can do this, they're probably going to be in pretty good shape to go into a networking position. But how often in the day-to-day are you going to have to deal with, like, the internals of Sprint networks? Okay? Probably not too often. And there are some other things that just are, for lack of a better phrase, kind of batshit crazy. Okay? So this is from the low-level programming, this is one of the learning outcomes that students be able to write a functional, standalone assembly language program, such as a basic telnet client with no external libraries. Now let's pause for a second. When we say no external libraries, what do we mean? Right? No libraries, no includes. Okay? You can't include anything. That also means no drivers, no TCP stack, or no TCP/IP stack. You are basically writing your own little operating system, your own drivers, everything from scratch. This is, for the NSA, a required learning outcome for all undergraduate students. Again, this kind of makes a lot of sense if you're writing implants, if you're making implants for things. It probably wouldn't hurt for every undergraduate student to be able to do this, but that's definitely a very, very high bar to set. Okay? So where are things going? Everybody seems to recognize that they're kind of failing on security, except NSA. And NSA is doing some revisions. Okay? I'm going to skip through this because I'm running a little short on time, and we're going to publish these slides. Okay? Really, where we're seeing a lot of the stuff coming down in academia is from ABET. ABET is working on their own accreditation for cybersecurity called CSEC 2017. The goal is to have that come out very, very soon. They're on version 0.75, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that's going to be the new accreditation for cybersecurity programs, that if you want to be accredited, you'll have to meet these guidelines. And it's being put together by a committee of committees formed by a committee of committee members. Okay, it is kind of, it's going to be a zebra, right? It's going to be a horse designed by committee. Okay? We see that coming out of the Computing Accreditation Committee within ABET. The Engineering Committee is also supposedly working on their own version of this, presumably for that 11% of that 11% that are housing security with engineering programs. But there's no public data on that yet. Okay. ABET is also in the process of revising its other accreditations, where we're adding some electives from a list, but security isn't one of those electives. Okay? Networking operating systems are, and that's a place where academia has traditionally housed security content, but CS seems like it's headed in the opposite direction. What it seems like is that security is going to get, rather than being integrated more into existing curriculums, it's getting pulled out as its own specialty, which I think is probably the opposite of the industry trend, where everybody has to do a little bit more security as part of their day-to-day work. So what does this ACM this ABET accreditation look like? Okay. Well, we've got 6 primary knowledge units and a number of cross-cutting concepts, none of which are crazy, right? Data security, software security, all of this makes a certain amount of sense. Okay. CIA, again, things that we traditionally see in industry certifications, risk, adversarial thinking, nothing too crazy. Now, if we start digging into this, the first version we looked at dates from back around April. That's draft version 0.05. I'm sorry, 0.5. What we see here are the specific topics covered within each one of these primary knowledge units. If we start to look at this, again, there's nothing too crazy here, but what this kind of looks like to me is a CISP spread out over 4 years. Okay? This looks a lot like the common body of knowledge for CISSP, which is maybe not such a bad thing. Okay? The common criticism of CISP is the lack of practical expertise. So we can maybe influence that by spreading it out, giving more hands-on time, not trying to cram the CBK into like a 1-week review seminar thing that you study for the test and then forget. So maybe that's not such a bad thing. But you'll notice this draft is 0.5. Where things are headed is a little bit weird. So this is draft 0.75. It's currently open for comment if you want to go put comments on it, and I highly suggest you do. Okay? So what we see is, going back, notice we have a relative focus on system security and less of a focus on software security. Also, application and societal security for those kind of IS programs that might be looking for this. Okay? What we see in the newer draft is even less of a focus on application security. We've gone from three topics down to 1 topic. We also see a lot of things that were previously in system security being pulled out and put under other areas, such as access control. Access control is now a data security topic rather than a system security topic. To be fair, they do indicate, and this is why we've got the question mark there, that they realized they had to revise this based on past comments and are still in the process of drafting what the system security looks like. But most of the stuff that was previously there got pulled out and put elsewhere. Now, we also see a number of things coming into existence that weren't previously there. Things like cyber crime, cyber law, more of a focus on policy. Global impacts is going to be an interesting one. When we start delving into these, we see a lot of interesting things that are with kind of a heavy emphasis on cyber warfare. Okay? So ABET seems to have taken the NSA's position that things like the law of armed conflict are important for every security student to know. In your day-to-day life, how many of you need to know the laws of armed conflict? Anybody? No one?
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay. Did you have to know the laws of armed conflict in relation to a cybersecurity role, though? Okay, fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Every student seems to need to know military law and the difference between military law and civilian law. Again, that seems like another kind of weird choice. It seems like they've taken a number of things from the cyber operations designation and kind of pulled it into their curriculum, okay? Which maybe makes sense if you're trying to find people to feed into military government space or government contractor space. I'm not so sure that your run-of-the-mill tech analyst needs to know about military law or the law of armed conflict. Okay. Now, if we start taking a look at where these kind of map to, computer science, the computer science ABET accreditation, at best, prepares people to be a developer. At best, it prepares people to be a developer. IT seems like it's probably pretty reasonable for system administrators. The information systems program seems like a pretty good place. It seems like a pretty good kind of program to prepare non-technical analysts, GRC types. And if we look at where things are trending, the previous version of the new accreditation by ABET, or ACM, seems to be pretty good for general security analysts. There's a lot of vagaries there, but those can be fixed, or those can be maybe expanded upon a little bit. The newer version probably doesn't make much sense for a technical role because we see more of a focus placed on policy and those kinds of issues. It might make some more sense for a GRC analyst. And the NSA, a CD program will probably produce a pretty good generic blue teamer. And cyber operations, I think, again, probably produces really just a state-sponsored offense position. Okay? So it seems like most graduates are getting security either in CSIT, information systems or software engineering, the kind of the classic places to get it, except with CE. Everyone seems to be adding security to their curriculum. Everyone is kind of developing their own thing, with it looking like security is going to be its own thing rather than baked into existing programs, which probably isn't the best, particularly for computer science. It seems like it's going to look a lot like a CISP. It's probably a good thing not to have the NSA be the only player in the space these days, right? The interests of the NSA are probably very different than the interests of industry in this respect, okay? So it's probably good to have some external views, although it does seem like the academic certifications are headed in the same way NSA is. It seems like most of the accreditations out there are geared towards generic blue team work, and there's very much a lack of things preparing people for offensive industry positions. So that's a space where I think people could improve. Okay? And as far as our recommendations go, I think one of the big things we need to do is have better metrics, because what? Yeah. Or maybe not just better metrics, but some metrics, right? Any metrics. If schools are going to, if schools are going to do this, if schools are going to pick up, let's say, CACD, which probably makes the most sense for most schools, it seems like IT or CSEC are prepared for a number of the new requirements, and oftentimes we'll see this done either as a master's degree, because those are big money makers for schools, or as a minor. Okay? It seems like the CO content is the best, if school wants to go for CO, it's the best fit for computer science or computer engineering, probably not IS or IT, because of the relative focus on operating systems and low-level concepts. IS is definitely not a place that could go for CO. And if we're going to see accreditations, there's probably space for an accreditation for industry offense. Lastly, something I didn't mention, one of the reasons why the security accreditation might fall flat is there is absolutely zero incentive for a school to do this. At best, that CSEC 2017 could be used to market to parents, That's the only incentive for doing this. Whereas the NSA designations, they were both the prime mover. They have higher brand name recognition, if you will. But there are also tangible grants to those. Once you get NSA designated, you can apply for grants that you could not otherwise apply for. There's nothing like that anywhere else. So with that, I will answer all of the questions in the few minutes we have left. Or does everyone just kind of want to make a break for lunch? Yeah.
Will the recording be available?
Yeah. So I think the recording will be available probably within a couple hours of this talk.
Is there anyone that we specifically are restricted with?
No, I think this is just going out on YouTube. Yeah. Any other questions?
So how difficult is the NSA designation to get for a school?
CACD is pretty easy. Yeah, so CACD is pretty easy. The CACO is harder really because for the content, as far as the content goes, let me hop back a bit. So the problem is in the breadth of classes. So if we look at this, we often see these classes housed, many of these classes already exist in various places, but there are oftentimes, the killer are prerequisite chains. Okay, so the IT department might offer this class, computer science might offer this class, and they have entirely different prerequisite chains that no two students could reasonably fulfill. That is one of the main problems. Yeah, but for CACO, or for CACD, this is, the 2-year and 4-year cores are pretty standard. Many programs could do this. And there are sufficient operational knowledge units that almost any school could field 5 or 10 of these without too much of a problem.
So this is not all-inclusive. They don't have to have all of this.
No. Yeah, so students.
Some from column 8.
Yeah. So students actually only have to get 5 of these. Okay. Any 5. Yep. Which does kind of is a little weird because if you let's say a school picks forensic accounting, OS hardening, database management, functional testing, and theory of computation, that's a weird 5. But
under a certain school of concentration, so under business school or computer.
Yeah, well, students who are graduating from the program that's accredited have to be able to take 5 of these. Yep. But that's not too hard of a thing to do for an academic program, given how broad this is, and it's probably intentional. So my co-speaker is not here today. Actually argues. I disagree with him. He argues that these designations were probably kind of reverse engineered around schools that they were already hiring from.
Makes sense.
Yeah, that's probably not unreasonable, but I don't know that the data is there to clearly indicate it. So, other questions?
Very good.
There's a list of schools that have all these accreditations?
We will have a list of schools. We don't have it right now. Basically, what we're doing is, I think I can pull it up. Let me just pull this over for a second, because I'm not sure what else is in that Google Drive folder. But actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But we are going to publish the data at some point. But basically, we've gone around school to school and looked all this stuff up. You can get the NSA stuff from the NSA. They do maintain a list of NSA schools. But the other information is we're just going web page to we're just going web page to web page. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right, thank you very much.